to the portion of the Passion Week where we will be discussing what's referred to as the Olivet Discourse. And we're going to study primarily from Matthew 24. It's talked about in Mark 13 and Luke 21. But for most people, Matthew 24 is generally the chapter that is considered whenever we talk about the Olivet Discourse. And so that's where we'll be this evening. Now, you'll notice that's verses 1 through 51. We're not going to go by verse. We don't have time for that. And we're going to move kind of at a rapid pace this evening. And so what we want to do is to set a good general framework for understanding the events that took place that Jesus is describing. When we're looking at the Passion Week, all of the events are centered around the temple. And this is kind of a climactic statement or teaching that Jesus gives about the temple of his day to his disciples. And it's a discourse of much discussion. There are some that think Matthew 24 is still something that's in the future and will come to pass at the end of time, whenever the Lord comes again the second time. But we want to look at it this evening and put it within the context that I think Jesus is discussing it. And to help maybe clarify some misunderstanding or some doubts or questions, maybe I'm probably going to raise some more questions, but hopefully put us in a way to where whenever we look at this, we can better grasp what it is that Jesus is speaking about. So the first thing we want to do is look at the time frame. Jesus is very specific about the time frame of the events of Matthew 24. When we go back to Matthew 23, as if there's not enough verses in Matthew 24, we notice that Jesus had just got through talking about the scribes and the Pharisees and the hypocrites. And so he talks about how that they had witnessed against themselves and how that they were the sons of those who murdered the prophets. And then Jesus tells them to fill up the measure of your father's guilt. And then he tells them that they were serpents, that they were a brood of vipers. And so whenever you look at those words, sons, fathers, and brood is offspring, you're looking at generational language. And so whenever we go to verse number 35, he says, on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. And so he said, you are the sons of those that murdered the prophets. Generations before you, your fathers murdered the prophets, and now you're going to fill up the guilt of your fathers. And whenever you fill up the guilt of your fathers, then as he says, all of the blood, the righteous blood shed on the earth is going to come down upon you, from Abel to the blood of Zechariah. And then in verse number 36, he says, assuredly I say unto you, all these things will come upon this generation. That's a phrase that we're going to hear a lot tonight. These things. And as we go through, we want to try to clarify what these things are. And then whenever you go into Matthew 24, at the section prior to talking about not knowing the day or the hour, Jesus says there, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So before he gets into 24, he says all these things are going to come upon this generation. What are those things that he's talking about? The judgment that was going to come on that generation. Whenever you look at the word generation, this definition refers to a specific time or a specific period of a group of people. A specific time or a specific period of a group of people. And there are several references that are made there. And so it's like Jesus is saying, okay, this generation persecuted and murdered the prophets. This generation murdered the prophets. This generation murdered the prophets. And then finally, this generation that he's speaking to, you murdered the prophets. And so the blood of all of these generations are going to come to bear, and the guilt of it on this generation, this period of people that he's speaking to. And so whenever we look at Matthew 23:36 and Matthew 24:34, we see it framed by this generation and this generation, which what we need to understand is what we're going to talk about in Matthew 24 has to fit within the time frame of that generation that was living at that time. Now, proponents of Matthew 24 being something that is off in the future, obviously this poses a problem. And so then there's discussion that comes up about, well, is that really what the word generation means? And some will report that that the meaning of generation is not necessarily a specific time or period of people, but it has to do with a race or a nation of people. And so whenever he says on this generation, he's talking about this nation or this race of people. And so it's going to be something that can be carried out 2,000 years later, but it's going to be carried out on this race or this group of people. But this word cannot mean that. And this word does not mean that. That definition of the word generation used here is a forced definition in order to try to make an idea of how end-time events are going to work fit. Because whenever you look at the word generation here, where Peter is specifically using it in the sense of a nation or a group of people, he uses a different word. And this is, if you'll notice, it's a little different. Genos, which has to do with that, a race of people. And so whenever Peter is talking about us being a chosen generation, we are a certain group of people, we are a certain nation, we are a certain race, so to speak. And so my point is that if the word generation is referring to a race of people, then this is the word that would be employed. And Jesus does not use that word in Matthew 23 and 24. So this is fundamentally about the origin or the identity of a group of people and not about a time period, but the word that Jesus uses stresses a generation living at the same time. So when Jesus says this generation, he's saying what I'm about to explain to you is going to happen in your time. Not something 2,000 plus years in the future, but in the time of those people that he's talking to. So Matthew 24 is about events that were to happen in the time of those living then, not pertaining to the nation of the Jews, sometime 2,000 plus years later. So let's look at the questions that were asked. In Matthew 23 and Mark 13 and Luke 21, the questions are pretty much the same. The disciples said, tell us when these things be. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of these things? Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of that these things are about to take place? So obviously the question we want to ask is, what are these things that he's talking about? What are these things that the disciples are asking about? Well, these disciples are asking in reference to a statement that Jesus made. In verse number 2, Jesus said, do you see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. So Jesus made that statement, and then the disciples asked the question, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Luke tells us again that Jesus said, these things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down. So what are these things? And one of the things that we're going to stress tonight is, as much as we can, let the Bible tell us what all of this stuff means. Because we're going to find some pretty good commentary of the Bible on the Bible whenever it comes to this. Whenever we look at Mark's account, Mark says that Jesus said to them, do you see these great buildings? So when Jesus said, do you see these things, what he's pointing to is the temple complex that could be seen from the Mount of Olives where they were. And so these things that he's talking about have to do with the temple and the destruction of that temple, because he tells them not one stone is going to be left upon another. The disciples marveled at the temple, and maybe in their mind they were thinking, okay, when the Lord's kingdom comes, that's all going to be ours. And Jesus is saying, you see those buildings? They're going to be leveled. Not one stone will be left upon another. And so obviously they're amazed by that statement, and their question is, when will these things be? Or what time is that going to happen? And what sign, what indication do we need to look for in order to determine that this is going to take place? So when will these things be? And what will be the sign? And notice here that the question is not what will be the signs, but what will be the sign. It's singular. A lot of times we'll look at Matthew 24, it's just a big list of signs. It's not a big list of signs, but rather it is a sign. There is a specific indicator that Jesus is going to point out to them. And so whenever we look at this statement, what is the sign of his coming in the end of the age? So then obviously the question is, okay, if these things are supposed to fit within that generation, how are we going to fit the coming of the Lord and the end of the age in that generation? How does that make sense? And a lot of times we will read this and we'll think, well, obviously this has to be talking about the end of the world. But again, whenever we look at the Bible and let the Bible explain the Bible, we're going to be able to see that what we're talking about does fit within that period of time in the lifetimes of those people. And so when shall these things be? What will it be when these things are about to take place? And so again, whenever we look at the definition of these things, whenever the temple complex is destroyed, what it's going to be indicative of is the coming of the Lord and the end of the age. And so these things pertain to the destruction of the temple complex, which is referred to as the coming of Christ and the end of the age. Well, what age are we talking about? Well, what age did the temple complex represent? The Jewish age. The Jewish age, the Jewish worship, the Jewish economy of that time. And so again, we point out that Jesus says all of that's going to happen in the generation that was standing there. So here's the answer that the Lord gives. In verses 4 through 8, he tells them, okay, false Christs are going to arise. He tells them that you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. What happens today whenever we have a lot of wars and rumors of wars? Preachers hit the TV. Okay. The Lord is coming. But you know, the irony of that is that whenever Jesus said that there would be wars and rumors of wars, the next thing that he says is not be fearful and be concerned. Notice what he says. See that you're not troubled. Don't be troubled at that. And the word troubled there means to be frightened or to be alarmed. And so whenever we hear wars and rumors of wars and people are trying to alarm us and frighten us over that, based on Matthew 24, it's a complete misunderstanding because Jesus said specifically, don't be troubled. Don't be troubled. He said, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, pestilence, famine, earthquakes in various places. He said, when all of these things happen, this is just the beginning of sorrows. This is just the beginning. Don't be troubled. Don't be alarmed. And the beginning of sorrows, the word sorrow there means the pain of childbirth. The pain of childbirth. And so if a wife is expecting and has that first contraction, we don't panic and load up and run to the hospital. I mean, we know, okay. But it's not time to get alarmed. Hopefully it's not. And some of us men might, but it's not, time to be alarmed or troubled. That's just a sign, that's just an indicator. And so, whenever we see that, we need to understand that all of these things that are taking place today, people want to use Matthew 24 to get us all worked up, and basically Jesus is saying, don't get worked up, that's just the beginning of things. In verses 9 to 14, he said that you'll have tribulation. And they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Here he speaks about the tribulation that the apostles and the Christians would experience. He said that there would be false prophets rising and deceiving many, that the love of many would grow cold. And then he says that the gospel was going to be preached to all the world, and then the end would come. And again, this is another thing that people look at that and say, well, this couldn't have happened during their time, because it says that the end's not going to come until the gospel is preached into all the world. In a lot of religious channels, whenever they do their money making, they'll say, hey, the Lord's not going to come until we preach the gospel to the world, so you've got to send us money where we can build satellite systems to get the gospel out to the world. Well, what does the Bible say about this? The Apostle Paul said in Colossians 1:23, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Paul wrote Colossians in about 60 to 62 AD, and Paul is already saying then, the gospel has been preached to every creature under heaven. Now see, whenever we think of being preached to all the world, we have an idea of what that looks like. But we want to understand it not on the basis of our idea of what it looks like. We want to understand it on the basis of what it looked like to the biblical writers. And in the mind of Paul, the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. And then Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. The abomination of desolation is a statement that's found in Daniel 9 and Daniel 12. Obviously, we're not going to get into that. But that's whenever he says the abomination of desolation by Daniel the prophet. What is that? And again, we don't have to do a whole lot of study to figure out what that is, because Luke tells us specifically what that is. You see, Luke was a writer to primarily a Gentile audience. And so whenever he was writing about these things, he kind of tempered the Jewish language that was used. And so to a Gentile, saying something about the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about didn't mean anything. And so whenever Luke wrote his record of these things, he spoke more straightforward. And Luke tells us in Luke 21 and verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that the desolation is near. That's the abomination of desolation. Whenever Jerusalem was going to be surrounded by the Roman armies, then they were to know. That was their sign. That was their sign. And that's literally what happened. They knew that whenever they saw Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, that it was going to be time to flee. Because notice verse 16. If you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. Notice at this instance that whenever they see this sign, it's a sign that puts Christians to flight. It causes them to flee. Now, if this is at the end of time, whenever the Lord comes at his second coming, are we going to be able to run from that? No, we'll be able to run from that. You run to a mountain, you know what? He's going to find you there. And so what he's talking about here is an event that is in the lifetime of those people that's going to affect their living at that time. If you're on your housetop, don't go down and start gathering things out of the house to take with you. Get out of the house and get out of town. If you're in the field, don't go back home and try to pack your suitcase. You just leave. There is a sense of urgency, because when you see the armies, you know that it's time to get out of town. If you're pregnant, obviously, that's going to be a difficult journey. If you're nursing a baby, pray that your flight is not in the winter or on the Sabbath. How much more that would complicate a flight of leaving Jerusalem whenever you see the abomination of desolation, the army surrounding Jerusalem. And then he says, then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. We hear about the great tribulation. When Jesus talks about great tribulation, he's talking about great tribulation that comes on the heels of the abomination of desolation that was going to put the Jews to flight. It's not something that's still in the future. It was something that he was speaking of to that generation. And it was a time of great tribulation. And again, we could do a lot of reading just in the book of Josephus, how he explains the horror that the city of Jerusalem and the people of that city went through at the hands of the Roman army. And there will be a great tribulation, and that is Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Notice what he says here. For where the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. The Jews were the carcass, and the Roman armies were the eagles. And history bears this out. In AD 66, after Jewish rebels expelled Roman forces from Jerusalem, Cestius Gallus, who was a Roman general, marched south from Syria. He surrounded Jerusalem and even breached the outer walls, and then suddenly and inexplicably, from a military standpoint, he withdrew. So he surrounded the city, was ready to converge on the city, and then he withdrew, which Josephus says, or rather Josephus says, that it was just without any just cause. Now there's some speculation as to why he did it, but on the surface it looked like, okay, the armies are surrounded, this city is about to fall, and all of a sudden they're pulled back. Eusebius writes in his history in the 4th century, the people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it to depart and to dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they called Pella. Well, what was the oracle by revelation? It was Jesus' Olivet Discourse. And that's exactly what happened. Epiphanius, another 4th century writer, said, for when the city was about to be captured by the Romans, all the disciples were warned beforehand to depart from the city and to dwell in Pella, a city of the Decapolis. Thus it came about that they left Jerusalem and dwelt there. And the story is said that not a Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem because they had been given a sign. And so whenever the city was encompassed, because my thought is, okay, if you wait until the city is encompassed, how are you going to flee? You're not going to be able to flee. But what happened, the city was encompassed, and then the soldiers were drawn back. The Christians understood that, they flee, and then later, 2 or 3 years later, Titus Vespasian comes in and then just levels the city. So the coming of the Lord. Immediately after the tribulation of these days, now we're going to get into the part where people read it and just think, this has got to be the end of the world. This has to be the second coming. This can't be something that happens in the lifetimes of those people. Well, immediately after the tribulation of those days, well, what are those days? Well, it's the days that he's been explaining. The abomination of desolation and all of these things are taking place. And he says that immediately after those days, that there will be a great tribulation. So, I'm ahead of myself here, I'm moving too fast. Then he says the sun will be darkened, the moon will give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. See, there, Matthew 24 is talking about the end of the world when the Lord comes a second time. Because when you see that, what do you think in your mind? You think of the end of the world. But let's let the Bible explain that to us. This isn't the first time in the Bible that this phrase is used. In Isaiah 13, we find here that the prophet speaking the words of the Lord talks about the day the Lord comes. And he says, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light, the sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. What was the prophet Isaiah talking about here? Was he talking about the end of the world? No. He tells us what he was talking about in verse number 1, the burden against Babylon. This was God speaking through the prophet judgment to come on the nation of Babylon. And that judgment was going to be so cataclysmic that it was going to be like to the Babylonians that the stars were falling from heaven and the sun was going to be darkened and the moon was not going to shine. Well, how was that going to happen? We'll go down to verse 17 and 19. The prophet says, speaking the word of the Lord, I will stir up the Medes against them. In verse 19, and Babylon will be overthrown as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So what we're talking about here is not a universal judgment, but it is a local judgment on a nation that was going to be so cataclysmic that it was spoken of as the stars falling from heaven, the sun being darkened, and the moon not giving it its light. And really what it was just one nation rising up against another nation and defeating that nation, all according to the will of God. Let's look again in Ezekiel 32, same language. I'll cover the heavens, the stars will be dark, I'll cover the sun with a cloud, the moon will not give her light, all the bright lights of heaven I will make dark over you. What's he talking about there? Is that the universal end of the world? No. Let's again look at the context. Ezekiel 32 and 2, Son of man, take up a lamentation for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. He's talking about judgment that was going to come upon Egypt. Again, using the same cataclysmic language to describe a local judgment. How is he going to do this? Look in verse number 11. For thus says the Lord, the sword of the king of Babylon shall come upon you. That he was going to use the Babylonians to bring judgment upon the Egyptians. Whenever we go back to Isaiah, one of the things that was said about that judgment that God was going to bring upon the Babylon, that their land was going to be laid desolate. Where have we heard that word before? Desolate. The abomination of desolation. Your house has been left desolate. In Ezekiel, he said, I will make the land of Egypt desolate. So what we're seeing is the judgment language that the prophets used towards Babylon and Egypt in the Old Testament, Jesus is employing to describe a local judgment that was going to take place during the time of those people there. A judgment against Jerusalem. Your house is left to you desolate. And then Luke, in Luke 21:20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. So if we were to put this in a chart to compare it, Babylon, here's the cataclysmic language. They were going to be defeated by the Medes in word in 539 BC, and it was going to bring about desolation. Egypt, the cataclysmic language, was going to be defeated by the Babylonians, 568, 567 BC. It was going to be made desolate. What's Jesus saying? Jesus saying, Jesus and the temple, he uses the cataclysmic language, is going to be destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and it was going to be made desolate. When we see all this language about stars, sun, and moon, we don't have to think about end of time and end of the world. We just simply look at how the Bible uses that language, and we get a very clear picture of how that fits within that generation. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Well, what is that sign? Well, that sign is this cataclysmic events that are taking place. Notice how Luke describes it. Luke, again, I may have already said this, is a great commentator on Matthew and Mark. He says, for the sun, there will be signs in the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth in distress, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, and in men's hearts failing them for fear and expectation of those things which are coming upon the earth. And whenever we look at this phrase, all tribes of the earth will mourn, there's only two places in the Bible where that phrase is used. Here in Matthew 24 and in Revelation 1, verse number 7, all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Well, if we're talking about a local judgment, why is it referring to all the tribes of the earth if it's just a local judgment? Whenever you look at the word earth, its Greek word is this, which is also translated land. And this word is used interchangeably in the Bible, depending on the context. And so whenever it says the tribes of the earth, it could also, and I think some Bibles do translate it, tribes of the land. The tribes of the land of Judea, that location there. And so we're talking about, whenever he says the tribe of the land, that would be the Jews. And obviously, their hearts would have failed them whenever they saw what was coming. And then the Son of Man coming on the clouds. So how is that the coming of the Son of Man? The statement, the coming of the Son of Man, is a statement that refers to divine authority or divine judgment. In other words, it's an event that happens in this time that has all of the appearance of something that is divine from above. And so that's why that the destruction of Jerusalem is referred to as the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds. If you look at Isaiah 19, talking again about the burden of Egypt, notice what the prophet says. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. Now, did the Lord literally ride on a swift cloud down to Egypt? No. It was that the punishment of Egypt was such that it bore the divine hallmarks of the work of the Lord. And coming in the cloud represents, again, authority and judgment. And so these comings that we're reading about are not literal comings, like in the end of the time whenever the Lord does come, but rather these are statements that are used metaphorical in order to represent divine presence and divine works in judgment. You know, when Jesus in Matthew 24, or 26 and 64, he told Caiaphas, after Caiaphas had asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And then Jesus said, it is as you say. And he told Caiaphas, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the power and coming in the clouds of heaven. How was Caiaphas going to see Jesus sitting at the right hand of power? He was going to see the demonstration of the kingdom coming with power, that was going to be a demonstration here in this world that he could see that would show that Jesus is at the right hand of the throne of God. And then he's going to see the coming of Jesus on the clouds of heaven. How was he going to see that? I think he was going to see that whenever the Lord came in his judgment upon Jerusalem. And then it says, I'll send your angels to the, and again, it sounds like it's, well, the angels are going out now. But the word angels that's used here is not always angelic or heavenly beings. The word angels is simply means messenger or an envoy. And the angels that are spoken of here could be angels in the sense of messengers of the gospel going out into all of the world. Remember what Jesus said to the Jews in Matthew 27:37. I wanted to gather your children together as her hens gather her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. So Jesus said, I wanted to gather you, but you weren't willing. So what's going to happen then is Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and then messengers are going to go out into all of the world, into the four winds of the world, and I'm going to gather those people to me. And so whenever we look at this verse, we see here, not again an end of time event, but something that could refer to the gospel going out. The parable of the fig tree. Again, he says that in this generation, this will happen. The word it that's used here, again, whenever he says that it is near, the word it here, some translation has, know that he is near, speaking about the coming of the Son, and that it would happen in that generation. And then there again, there's the definition of the generation, and then the chart. No one knows the day or the hour. Okay. Verse 36. But of that day and hour, no one knows. Now there seems like, and there's a question about, okay, is Jesus transitioning now from the destruction of the Jerusalem to now where he's talking about the end of time whenever the Lord comes? And so the question is, what is that day? Is that day that he's about to address, is that day the destruction of Jerusalem, or is that day the second coming of Jesus? And the answer is yes. Yes. Whenever you look at not knowing the day or the hour, only the Father, but as in the days of Noah. Again, Luke is very good at explaining this to us. Luke talked about the destruction of Jerusalem in Luke 17. And we can read there how he takes this language and he refers it to exactly what we've been talking about in Matthew 24. I'm running out of time, so I won't take time to read it. But he talks about that generation rejecting, and then he says that it's going to be as in the days of Noah and in the days of Lot. But then whenever he talks about it being as in the days of Noah and in the days of Lot, notice down here in verse number 31, that in that day he is on the housetop, and his goods are in the house, they will not come down to take them away. Where have we heard that? We heard that in Matthew 24 when Jesus was explaining, okay, when this is about to happen to Jerusalem, don't run down and get your stuff and flee. You just get out of town. And notice here that Luke is explaining Jesus' words about Noah in reference to that destruction of Jerusalem. And he talks about one will be taken and the other will be left behind. And then again, wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Where did we read that? Talking about the abomination of desolation whenever the armies. So he's saying, okay, whenever the armies circle the city of Jerusalem, it's going to be like in the days of Noah and the days of Lot. You're not going to know when it is unless you listen to the words of the Lord. Lot, or rather Noah, and Sodom's judgment are typical of God's judgment in general. Anytime time God carries out judgment or carries out judgment in the Bible, he does it pretty much the same way every time. He gives people warning, and sometimes he'll give them a time frame and he'll give them signs, but he never gives the day or the hour. And so, whether that judgment is a local judgment, he doesn't give the day or the hour, or that judgment is the end-time judgment, as in the case of 2 Peter 2, where he's talking about the false prophets and talking about the judgment that's going to come upon them. Notice who he references: Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah. So, the day of judgment in the end is going to be like Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction of Jerusalem is going to be as in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then every other judgment follows that typical pattern. And so whenever Jesus applies that pattern to the destruction of Jerusalem, he's just applying what applies to all of God's judgment. And so then we're called to be a faithful servant. Blessed is that servant. So, if Jesus gave you the day and the hour that he was going to come, would you live differently than you're living now? Okay? It's like a test in school. If you're going to have a test and you know the day and the hour of the test, what are you going to do? You're probably not going to do anything until it's time to. But if it's we used to call them pop tests, you don't know, what do you try to do? You try to stay ready all the time. And that's what God wants from his people. He wants people that are ready all the time, and not a group of people that's just going to try to cheat the calendar of God's judgment. And so whenever he calls and he gives these judgments, what he's calling for and not giving the day and the hour is because he's looking for repentance in his people. And so we want to be a good servant, that whenever the Lord comes, they wanted to be a good servant, that whenever the Lord comes, in that context, they could see him coming, so they were ready to flee, and they would be saved. But an evil servant says the master's delaying his coming. And they're not sober, they're not vigilant, and then before they know it, then they're overcome by the Roman army. Which is, a point to make, is that whenever Cestius Gallus encompassed the city and the people went back, or the soldiers went back, Jewish forces pursued them, and the Jews thought they had defeated, that they had repelled the Roman army, and they were safe now. Only to have Titus to come back about 2.5 to 3 years later, and that was the end of it. But Christians knew the words of Jesus. No, they haven't been beaten back. They haven't been defeated. And so they left town, and then they were saved. And then notice the last verse, and we'll wrap it up here. Talking about the judgment that will come, you'll cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Why does he say, appoint him his portion with the hypocrites? Why hypocrites? Whenever the Lord comes in his judgment at the end of time, there's going to be hypocrites, there's going to be thieves, there's going to be murderers, there's going to be adulterers, there's going to be covetous. Why does he speak specifically to hypocrites? Let's go back to the prelude of all of this discussion. In Matthew 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. What's Jesus saying here? That if you're not faithful, then you're going to suffer the same judgment with all of these hypocrites that are the reason for this judgment on Jerusalem. And all of this took place in the lives of those people living there in 70 AD. Jesus' words were true. Jesus spoke this in about 30 to 33 AD. 40 years later, this came to pass. And again, if you want some reading to do, Josephus explains the things that took place in very graphic detail that can give us an understanding of the severity of God's judgment on that generation for rejecting Jesus and rejecting his messengers. God's judgment is sure. God's judgment is sure. And so, as he's getting ready to go to the cross, he speaks against that whole system that's about to put him to death, knowing all the while that while they're crucifying him, their judgment was coming, to give confidence to the disciples to continue on. Appreciate your attention and hope that we've been able to digest a little bit of that. If you're here this evening and have a matter to bring to the attention of the congregation, please come and stand.